Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to another video version of one of my Substack essays. I'm Dr. Devin Price, if we believe in social media branding and PhDs, and I'm here on YouTube live right now. If you're watching it live, if you're watching the VOD, these are live streams where I read and record a audio version of my essays for accessibility purposes, for people who can't see, for people who can't read text very easily, ADHDers, people who prefer to get their information while they're driving or doing chores, etc. And of course, there's always a ton of like really enriching conversation about the topic and the piece that happens during the live stream chat. So it's a good little time. My hair is really long. It's been a minute since I've streamed last. I'm moving into, I think, a little bit more of a relaxed writing cadence on Substack for a bunch of different reasons. I've kind of always suspected that I put out too much too quickly, and I've also kind of so I don't give people enough time to read my long ass shit and kind of overload people. And also, um, I am doing a lot more workshops and interviews and talks and kind of different things, and making changes. So I'm gonna stretch out the publication cadence a little bit, though we will have another research roundup post next week. Um, Always good to relax. Yes, thank you. But this week's is a research roundup post that we're going to be talking about, and it's all about a scientific study that looked at millions, which is really impressive, a sample size wise, millions of Twitter posts surrounding political issues from a couple years ago, back when Twitter was still a little bit more politically relevant, and it examined the type of language that people use in their posts about political topics, specifically whether the language is kind of designed to inspire a sense of moral outrage in the viewer, and whether using that kind of heightened, morally outraged language translates to the post succeeding and actually getting people to take the political action that the poster wants. So we'll talk about all that. There's really some pretty cool stuff methodologically in this study, and I think those also be stuff that like people here in the chat will have good questions about, because me being a social psychologist, there's a lot of things about how we measure and operationalize things. And operationalization is basically just taking the idea of a variable and translating it into a specific measurement, right? So, like, how do you measure love in a romantic relationship? How do you measure whether someone is politically conservative or liberal or leftist or something else? That's operationalization, figuring out how to translate those things. So almost anytime you have a research question, you have this big, abstract, real world question, and you have to find a very kind of specific, narrow set of scientific parameters to translate it into, to even, excuse me, begin to, that you need to translate it into to even begin to answer the question. But anytime you're doing that translation, that measurement, operationalization process, you're losing a lot of the reality of the thing that you want to study. You're creating a survey that's not really the thing. It's the map, not the territory. So I love talking about that stuff, and there's a lot of ways in which we in social psychology, my home field, measure stuff that is pretty goofy and silly, and I think strikes the average non-social psychologist as, what the hell? You did not just measure that thing you thought you measured. You just asked somebody to self-report on a survey if they recycled. You didn't look at whether they actually did. And we do a lot of stuff like that, especially when it comes to political research. So I like sharing that stuff with a more general audience. Y'all always have really good questions and press F to doubt moments about it, which is really nice. And there's things that, like, I don't know what somebody doesn't know who hasn't been studying this stuff for 15 years, and so it's always really helpful to just talk to other people and see their read on it. Um, yeah. So there's a lot of good stuff already cooking in the chat, I could tell. So today's essay is all about, posting about political topics and whether you have your intended effect when you're trying to generate political action. And so I opened the stream with this question for y'all. What role do you think heightened or emotional language should play in social media posts about political topics? So, should we be careful about the emotional effect that we're going to have on the viewer? Um, should we try to harness emotionally heightened language insofar as it does motivate people to take action, and so on and so forth? Um, Cloud says this feels like a real pickle because people generally discount folks if they have heightened emotions. But, like, of course, people have heightened emotions about issues that deal with, like, basic human rights. And there should be a place to express that. But, like, if you're trying to change minds, okay, making an impassioned plea only works if the other person already cares. And works generally has only meant get sympathy in my experience and not actually pushed someone to action. Especially if it's an issue that the common person has no idea how to fix, like systemic access issues. Yeah, so a lot of what Cloud is talking about here is the phenomenon of context collapse on the internet. And context collapse, I'm sure many of you are familiar, is this idea that you see a lot of different types of conversations all happening in the same place on the social internet, and you can't necessarily read into a post who the intended audience is, who is talking to whom and addressing whom in that conversation, whether what's being shared is meant to be an expression of grief for other members of the community to sit in and experience, or if it is meant to be a persuasive message directed at a general audience meant to spur that general audience into action, right? There's a very big difference between I'm really pissed at, let's say, something that cisgender people have done, and I want to just vent about it and find sympathy from other trans people on the one hand, and I want to convince cis people to do a specific actionable thing politically for me, and I'm addressing those cis people. But on social media, you don't have that sense of context for the most part. All of those conversations are all happening at once in the same place. And so a lot of the conflicts that we see happen on social media about political topics is a uh, a divergence in or across purposes in context, where one person is criticized for saying a message that is not very persuasive, not very warm and encouraging, but that wasn't what they were even trying to do. They were just trying to vent, or vice versa. Or that people just don't know the audience, right? That you're talking about some topic that the average person doesn't know or care about, and you're using language that they can't follow. And so they're going to either misinterpret you or not care. That's also a loss of context. So context collapse can happen either on the audience side or on the creator side of things. And an absence of context means that your message is never going to be tailored specifically only for your one intended audience. It's going to be met by a bunch of different other people who might interpret it completely differently and have a completely different emotional response, which can cause a lot of problems. Um, and like Cloud said, there should be a place to express grief, to talk among members of your community, to dive into these things. But also, unfortunately, if you're doing it on social media, you're doing it for a public audience of anyone who can see that post, and how they might take it is totally different. Hi, Birdie Bits, welcome. Hello, Ula Mui. Gift Horse says a common response to impassioned pleas is judgment. Desperation makes people uncomfy, and judging it soothes themselves so they can move on and not have to engage. Great point. Yes. Sometimes people's empathy in evoking an empathetic response from them doesn't lead to them being kinder to you. It means they are in pain and they locate you, the person who's desperate, as the source of that pain. And so then they want to detach from you, or they're angry at you for making them feel that way, which is just like one of those many complexities to human empathy that is really challenging. Ulamui says, I think emotional language on political posts can cause like anxiety or stress, but it also communicates the urgency or alarm of a political situation. So, like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm with you on that, Ulamui. I know that for me, and I think for a lot of people, we certainly see a lot of discourse about this online, usually in the language of moral OCD, which I don't think is necessarily the most helpful way to think about it, to treat it as if it's a personal pathology to like feel guilty when you're being guilted. But like there are a lot of messages online all happening at once. There's a lot of people that are always on the verge of losing housing. There are hundreds of thousands of Palestinian fundraisers who are in Gaza and need urgent medical care, need food, need help getting out of the country, or getting out of the open air prison that they've been forced into, because they're not allowed to have a country. And they all have equal urgency and felt like emotional intensity there. And if you're sounding an alarm all the time, it ceases being an alarm. And unfortunately, because there is this context collapse of the internet, you get all these pleas for help, all happening at once, all with equal intensity. And an individual person can't really solve that. They can't donate to everything. And they can't even process that much constant alarm. And so there is, I don't know if compassion fatigue is exactly the right word there, but there is kind of a self numbing and a checking out that happens, or people get really overloaded with anxiety and stress and guilt. Um, and so it's difficult. Sometimes fewer requests for help actually might lead to more helping. And that's something that I'd really like to see studies on. I'm sure there have been some studies about it, especially with things like helping people asking for money on the street. Because living in a city like Chicago for as many years as I've lived, there's really a phenomenon that does happen where if you are being asked for money by someone in a desperate situation, every block that you're on, you get very numb to it. And a lot of people, unfortunately, get really hostile to unhoused people that are asking them for money. And it's it doesn't matter whether it's a moral response or not. It's a thing that happens psychologically, that if you can't give money to everyone that's asking you for money, you sometimes make a decision not to give at all. And there's sometimes little like mental tricks that you kind of have to play on yourself to keep your empathy alive, because having a emotional connection with every single person that you see in that situation, it gets to a point where you just can't do it, or you just don't do it because it is so overwhelming. um, so for me, one of my kind of tricks is that I make sure that I know and have an ongoing relationship with several homeless people in my neighborhood. I'm using the terms homeless and unhoused interchangeably here because plenty of people identify as that and don't like unhoused, or they self-describe as homeless. If I know the person, if I know their name and I talk to them outside of my Walgreens on a regular basis, I'm gonna find it very hard to ignore them walking into that Walgreens. It's going to keep me honest. Even if I'm in a hurry or stressed or having a compassion fatigue moment, that's Kevin. I know him. We've talked. We've made jokes to each other about how our names rhyme. Like he's complimented my outfits. I know that he wants a guava monster energy drink. Like, how am I going to let my compassion shut down no matter what I'm going through? And so that's kind of how I resolve that issue. And also, I think like it's also just more meaningful to have relationships with people, and that's also something that a lot of homeless people need because they're treated like they're invisible. So that's one form of compassion fatigue, but I think there's a lot of similarities psychologically to what's happening online. That's just a guess mechanistically of what's happening in people's brains and in my brain. um, I bet there's studies out there, but I'm not aware if there are. Birdie Bit says, bit of a hear me out, but I think harassment campaign logic works here. If one wave is very intense and forces the convo, a second, more reasonable wave can act as a legitimizing force. I think that's a really good insight, Birdie Bits, that not every message needs to do everything. So there's the awareness or sounding the alarm component of a message. And then there's the, now that you are alarmed, I can offer you a salve in the form of an action that you can take. And I think that lines up with the study results in a lot of ways, that the morally outraged post does not lead to action, but it can have an indirect statistical effect on driving people to take action later on. So we'll get into that in a second, but I think that's a legit interpretation of the study results too. Male Valence, hello, says in the context of the study results, I would think heightened language has a role in reacting to things or processing emotions, but maybe less good for getting people to take action. Yeah. Again, not every post needs to do everything, and urgency being a white supremacy culture thing, sometimes getting people to take urgent action isn't where you can start, as frustrating as that might be. Birdie Bits, just further clarifying, not targeting individuals' mind, but as a two-pronged strategy. Also requires people joining the legitimate wave to actually work with and not sell out the intense core. Right. Um, yeah, that there needs to be some coordination here, and part of what I'm hearing you say is that the alarm sounding phase or the moral outrage phase, it's kind of in the political science research we talk about setting an agenda, that making a political issue a part of the agenda means it becomes something that people are talking about and thinking about. So if an issue just isn't on most people's lips, if it's not at the front of their mind, then there isn't much political motion that's going to happen on it because people are not mobilized. You might have a really hardcore, like you said, intense core of people who care about that topic. But if most people have never even thought about it before, it's going to be really hard to get people to go to an action, to call the representatives, to sign a petition, to take more radical steps around it. An example of that for me, where I think it really worked to sound the alarm, was Occupy Wall Street. A lot of people talk about the Occupy Wall Street protests as a failure because they were thrown out of Zuccotti Park. And after a number of protests all around the world in financial centers, they were kind of quashed by the state, and they didn't get what they wanted, which primarily was debt forgiveness and a fundamental change to the economic system. But debt forgiveness was the main one. However, they, through their action and the attention that they got on the news, politically, etc., Occupy Wall Street really put that phrase, we are the 99%, into people's heads. This idea that there is a 1% that owns almost all of the wealth, regardless of how much that's actually statistically true. The stats are actually a little bit different from that. There's actually more like a 10% that's like millionaires. But what Occupy Wall Street wanted to do, in part, was get people aware of wealth inequality and get them talking about capitalism and wealth inequality. And for people who are younger, you really might not know how verboten it used to be to talk about capitalism being the source of the problem. In my youth, you sounded like a crank if capitalism was where you located the problem, and it wasn't really entertained in classrooms or professional settings, or on the news, or in op-ed columns. And now almost everybody is comfortable talking about the flaws with capitalism. Even conservatives, or moderates at least, kind of have to acknowledge it. And so Occupy Wall Street did have a powerful role in setting an agenda. Politicians haven't done anything about it because they have nothing to gain from addressing wealth inequality, right? But in terms of the political consciousness and what mobilizes people now, and the kinds of political critiques that the average person makes, and what's considered acceptable to talk about and push back against, capitalism and wealth inequality are on people's tongues now. It is part of the agenda. And so it might have taken a long time and a lot of protests, but the agenda has been set in a lot of ways, I would say. I think that's still a meaningful difference and a meaningful change that helps bring us closer to something more significant. And so there is a role, I think, Birdie Bits, to your comment, to having this large movement oriented around just getting people talking about the topic and persuading more people to care. And then you have this moment where you have this momentum that could either be captured by the elite. The book Elite Capture by Olufemi Otaiwo is amazing. Sometimes you have this liberal elite that takes the issue and takes ownership of it and steals away all of the political momentum that it might have. You could definitely say that that's happened with Black Lives Matter, for example, where it became about personal identity and the wealth and success of a handful of Black individuals within the imperial core, rather than dismantling the laws that make white supremacy anew every single day. So there was this moment of agenda setting with Black Lives Matter that got more people thinking and talking about racial inequality and anti-Blackness. And that did rein in a lot of different conversations. Did it lead to the changes we all wanted to see? Not necessarily. So that's that second part that Birdie Bits is talking about. It requires people joining the legitimate wave that has a political vision of what to do about this problem, rather than it being sold out to kind of the liberal moderates who are going to always make things more capitalistic, more individualistic, and less politically challenging. So yeah, great insights. I think I'm with you. I think I see your point for sure. Part of me wants to hate all morally outraged posts because they make me feel bad and they stress me out and they make me mad at the person doing them. I feel manipulated and my PDA just goes off the rails. But I think you're right. Like, there is a role in getting people frothed up into a fury about things. Hi, Maddie. I'm glad you're here. Hello. Hi, Annika. Trans Peaks. Melvin says, I think low affective empathy helps in these situations. Yes. I think if you don't have really intense emotional empathy, you are less likely to get overloaded when you see literally thousands of people begging online for money so that they can continue to live. And I also wonder too, though, how much does it sometimes feel like low affective empathy when you're having compassion fatigue and you're shutting down emotionally? You know what I mean? So I'm often asking myself these days, do I not have empathy, or am I just so shut down because it hurts? And is that helping or hurting? It's a real tricky one. Cloud says, I wonder about the intersection of this with the idea that the squeaky wheel gets the grease with the overload. Yeah, it's tough. I think for advocacy, like it is good to just keep, especially if you have some bureaucratic system that's ignoring you, if you can just hit them and hit them and hit them again repeatedly with lots of people and lots of documentation and lots of disruption, sometimes you can get what you need. But part of the question is, like, are you squeaking at the right people? What's the squeaking going to do? And that goes back to your question of, do the people have the power to create a systemic change? And that was one of the big problems with, or challenges for, Occupy Wall Street, for Black Lives Matter, for almost any kind of political movement in our memory, I think. Yeah, we can get more people caring. We can maybe get more people into the street. But are any people in our existing political system going to listen to them? Do they have any reason to? Is in any way the operating mechanisms of the state influenced by people's opinions and outrage? And if it's not, then you can't only get to the point of agenda setting, of generating outrage. Something else needs to happen, and it can't be just making an appeal. Because if you're making an appeal, you are still reinforcing the existing, or playing within the rules of the existing power structure. And direct action is just doing the thing, making the change, rather than asking someone to make the change. And that's the kind of anarchist solution, is to do the thing yourself. Dismantle the police yourself, wink wink. Dismantle capitalism yourself, wink wink. But that itself is a political ask, right? You're not going to be able to dismantle the state, just you and your like 5 buddies. You have to persuade other people that it's actually going to be worth the immense risk of doing that. And I think that's where some of this research is maybe relevant to us, even though a lot of us watching this are anarchists or radical leftists who might say, I don't care if people sign a petition. I don't care if people call their representatives. There still is this question of mobilizing people to take action, some kind of action. And I think the more radical or risky the action is, the higher a bar it is to clear, persuasively and motivationally. And I think even though this study is only looking at the target behavior of, do people sign a petition, I think we can still take some messages from here and apply it to the problem of, how do we get people to do direct action. I think there, some of the principles found in this study make enough sense that I think it applies. but we'll find out. We'll see. Hello, Mick says, hey, I finally managed to catch a live stream. Welcome, welcome. Wave Lev says, a Piscord live stream. My day is made. Welcome. And for people who don't know, the Piscord is a Discord server where people who watch the chats for this and Time Theft Today, me and Maddie's live stream show, hang out and continue the conversation with each other. They talk about anarchist things, child liberation, crafting, outfit picks, pics of pets, venting about horrible medical self-advocacy stuff, just talking about stuff that disabled, trans, autistic freaks and anarchists and perverts like to talk about. And so if you are enjoying watching these streams, you can hang out on the Piscord as well, and participate. I'm gonna just put a link in the chat for anyone who is not already a member of the Piscord. And and Male Valence has a very helpful tip for everybody who's watching these streams. YouTube by default puts the chat into top chat mode, which means you only see the top chat messages. How it determines what the fuck a top chat message is, I don't know. But that means it hides the occasional message. So you want to go up to the top of the chat and click the little caret next to top chat and select live chat instead if you want to see all the chat messages, which I encourage you to do. And I'll pin the Piscord link there too. All right. So this is a shorter essay than I normally do. It's a tight 2,700 words, which is nothing. But we're gonna switch to screen share and pull it up and start talking through it, because I think this is one I want to have a relatively quick-ish stream today. But I also think this being a scientific study post, people are gonna have lots of questions and things that I will think are already clear that are just not clear because I have, expert brain, which makes you stupid. If you know too much about something, it makes you a fool about imagining what other people know about the thing. And it also makes you get very used to the flaws within your field without thinking about them as flaws. So please, if anything I say makes no sense, if anything in the write-up is just too much of a technological term, or even if you're just like, I don't understand how scientifically or statistically this is doing the thing it says that it's doing, please put that in the chat, because then that tells me that there's more I need to unpack when I write these things, because I have some more research roundups coming out soon, so I want to do them right. So this piece is free to read, as all my stuff is, at drdevinprice.substack.com. And the post title is Moral Outrage Makes Posts Go Viral, but Positive Messaging Gets Results. What the latest social science has to say on digital engagement, the framing of political messages, and their impact on real-world action. Got a little research roundup header here. And then I have an image from Unsplash of a Black Lives Matter protest. Outside of the Presidential Foundation and Institute, there are a bunch of protesters sitting in a tight cluster together with their phones raised and the flashlights on their phones lit up. And some people are holding signs, and most people are wearing masks. And so this is both showing physical on-the-ground protest action around a political issue that remains salient today, that was mobilized by a lot of online activity, and also people are holding their phones where a lot of that mobilizing happens, and where posting lives. So that's kind of the thought behind that as a cover image. I'm learning to explain the metaphors that I have in mind in my cover image selections, because I know it doesn't always make sense. All right, let's dive in. My earliest social scientific work was in the area of political psychology, where I largely specialized in studying the psychology of tolerance and open-mindedness. Through conducting survey and experimental studies on people's willingness to change their opinion. Oh, nope. I thought I typoed that word. No, the word I wrote was correct. Though conducting survey and experimental studies on people's willingness to change their opinion was dispiriting for a variety of reasons, I still receive updates from a lot of the major political psychology journals in my inbox and try to keep up to date. So here I've linked to some of the studies that I've done in the past about political tolerance. This is my dissertation from 2014 that was looking at whether people who have more political expertise are more tolerant of opposing viewpoints and why that is. Typically, research finds that people who are very politically involved and know a lot about politics are actually more tolerant to opposing views. And so in this dissertation, I explored whether it is the fact that people who are more involved in politics hold like democratic values more closely to heart, and that's why they're more tolerant of differences in opinion. And that's kind of what my results suggested the mechanism was, that expertise leads to tolerance through increased holding of democratic values or belief in democratic values. It's kind of a lib principle. I think maybe now I would say that a lot of political experts are more tolerant of people with different viewpoints than themselves because they're all just playing the game together. You know, they're colleagues. If you are a longtime professional Democratic Party member, you probably just see a lot of party members of the Republican Party as just like your coworkers, and everything you're doing is like a big performance. And so, of course, you're tolerant of them having different viewpoints because you've gotten so jaded and you're so wrapped up in the existing power of the state that you don't really believe in any of it anymore. And so you don't care if somebody's opinions differ from yours because you don't even believe in your opinions. But that's a rant for another day. I also did a lot of research on open-mindedness. I developed a scale measuring a person's willingness to consider different political viewpoints. It's called the Open-Minded Cognition Scale, or OMC, and it's loading real slow, so we don't need to look at that. And I found studying this stuff really unmotivating for a lot of reasons. One of them is the replication crisis in social psychology. You can read about it a little bit at this link here, or you can read a little bit about it in my book Unlearning Shame. But basically, when I was coming up in grad school, there was this massive crisis of confidence in the science that we were all doing because a lot of landmark studies could not be reproduced by other researchers. And then there was a explosion in attempts to take a study that had already been published, take their methodology, take all their materials, and restudy that same question using all of those materials. And a lot of times that was done, this replication of an existing study was done, the results didn't show up. And a lot of it suggested that researchers were using questionable practices to find the significant results that they found initially, and that a lot of times researchers were not fully reporting every single thing that they did, and they were actually subtly influencing participants to give them the results that they wanted. Or they were using statistical tricks that increased their odds of finding a significant effect without reporting that they had used those statistical methods. And so a lot of studies that were very famous, like the effect of like power posing on women's confidence before job interviews, it just couldn't be reproduced. And it seems to just not be a real phenomenon based on many, many attempts at reproducing the research. Lots of studies like that on priming research. Birdie Bit says, not the p-values. Piss hacking, I think it's called. Yep, p-hacking. Fishing expeditions, post hoc theorization, or post hoc hypothesizing. So forming a prediction after you've already seen the results and then being like, wow, I found what I predicted. That's not the scientific method. So that was really dispiriting for me. And also the lens through which social psychology analyzes a lot of topics is really liberal. They don't really question just like neoliberal political norms and don't really think about anything outside of conventional like Democratic Party organizing. I write about that a little bit in my previous piece. Political polarization was never the problem. Do we really need more centrists, or do we really need more reaching across the aisle in a genocidal empire? So you can read about that there. So I hate my field, but I still read some of the studies. I also feel strongly that academia and science journalism both consistently fail to bring new findings to the public with either digestibility or accuracy. And I try to remedy that with my research roundup writing where I can. To wit, there have been a number of studies published recently in the journal Social Psychology and Personality Science that I think many readers who are passionate about activist organizing, mobilizing the masses against fascism, and understanding the oppressive systems undergirding racism and transphobia might find interesting. That's a later article that I'm going to talk about. And so, in a series of new research roundup pieces rolling out this month, and now March, this other month, I am going to summarize a new political psychology study, explain the methodology and findings, throw out a few caveats and considerations for people who want to put the data into work in their own on-the-ground work. So here's the first entry in the series. Moral outrage spreads posts, but it doesn't inspire action. We're talking about posting. It's a posting episode, everybody. Ever since Barack Obama encouraged his supporters to use change.org to supposedly shape his presidential platform, all the way back in the early 2010s, Democratic organizers have been treating the site as a way to bend policymakers' ears. You've all seen it, right? Like change.org petitions are a major part of kind of conventional Democratic Party political currency. And since the earliest days of social media, online activists have been leveraging the rhetoric of moral outrage, panic, and shame to galvanize the public into action. Of course, organizers have been using morally outraged language long before that as well. But does it work? In a research article titled Moral Outrage Predicts the Virality of Petitions for Change on Social Media, but not the number of signatures they receive, international team of researchers Stefan Leach, Magdalena Formanowitz, Jan Nikodon, and Alexandra Chikocha examined the content of social media posts that encouraged users to share and sign petitions. And they tried to determine if there was a statistical relationship between the types of messaging that those posts used, the language used in those posts, and the petition's success. I love this article because it is actually a well-written and accessible-ish research article. I love that the title actually tells you not just what they were studying in a general way, but the exact findings. Like, it's on the tin. Moral outrage predicts the virality of petitions for change on social media, but not the number of signatures. So if you use morally outraged language in your post is more likely to go viral, but it is not more likely to get people to actually click on the link to a petition that is in that morally outraged post. You can pack it up and leave if that's all you want to know. There is some more complexity there. It's worth sticking around. And in fact, some of the findings do suggest that moral outrage serves a purpose, but it does not serve the purpose of getting clicks on petitions. So stick around, but I do love that the title of the article just tells you what the fuck's going on. Bug Boy Wizard says, I was literally wondering about this yesterday, like how effective these campaigns even are. And I'm so happy that today we have research to bear on this stuff. Like, it feels like this generation of researchers coming up is doing some interesting stuff, and it's making me a little bit less jaded. The research team searched exhaustively through English language posts made to X/Twitter between January and June of 2023. So a couple years ago, 3 years ago, when Twitter was certainly already in a decline, but was not just like the hellhole where everybody is just like doom posting at each other. Or I haven't been on Twitter for like over a year and a half. So you tell me what Twitter is like, but it's bad now. But they scanned through Twitter posts from January to June of 2023, and they searched exhaustively for content that included links to change.org petitions. So this is just for the sake of having kind of consistent comparability in what is being looked at here. They're only looking at posts that link to change.org petitions. But they did look at every post that included a link to a change.org petition from that time period, which is really dope. Like, this isn't a subset, this isn't a tiny sample. They looked at over 1 million posts from that time period, and it's every single one made to the platform during that time period, which is so awesome, scientifically speaking. And unfortunately, this is something where large language models can be a bit of an asset in just flagging things, like searching for language use and flagging things to help get researchers started. More on that later. From the resulting pool of 254,213 petition posts, the researchers found posts with links to 24,785 unique petitions. So they looked at every post made to Twitter between January and June of 2023. From that pool of every Twitter post, they looked for every link to a change.org petition. In that time period, there were 254,213 posts that included a link to a change.org petition. Of those 254,213 posts, there were 24,000 unique, different change.org petitions. Hopefully that makes sense. Because the researchers were interested in both the social media popularity of a petition and how many signatures these petition posts generated, the researchers then zoomed back out, looking for every single post on Twitter that had ever linked to any of those distinct 24,785 petitions. That gave them, so that now they're zooming outside of that time frame of January to June of 2023 and looking for any post that ever linked to one of those 24,000 plus petitions. The resulting sample of posts that they found was well over 1 million in number, 1,286,442 posts that included links to change.org petitions. So that is what they are analyzing, is over 1 million, 1.2 million, almost 1.3 million posts that include links to change.org petitions that appeared sometime initially during January and June of 2023. So now they're going to look at the language used in those posts. Next, Leach and colleagues attempted to look at the content of the posts along several dimensions: moral outrage, agency, group identification, and pro-sociality. So the main exciting takeaway in this study has to do with moral outrage, but they looked at other aspects of how these posts were written. Specifically, those 4 things. Does the post use the language of moral outrage? Does the post use the language of agency? I'll explain what each of these are. Does it use language of group identification? And does it use language of pro-sociality? These are not independent. It is possible for a post to use all 4. These things are not mutually exclusive. You could have a post that uses very morally outraged language and also uses language that promotes agency or promotes pro-sociality. And you could have any possible combination of those things, or you could have none in your post. If you just post a link to a change.org petition with no words, it would have none of those things. And the study also is measuring the extent to which each post is using moral outrage. So one post could be more morally outraged than another, but they could both exhibit some language of moral outrage. So we got 4 variables that are all potentially interlocking and interacting with each other, and they're each on a continuum, right? There's a degree of how much morally outraged language you are using in a post. So now let's talk about how each of those 4 variables was assessed in the posts. Moral outrage was assessed using an algorithm called the Digital Outrage Classifier, which was originally developed by William Brady and colleagues in 2021. So this is a measure that's been used in numerous studies at this point to study and examine and document how much outraged language is present in a post. In this prior work, Brady and his collaborators looked at over 26,000 tweets related to social and political issues that had inspired a lot of user outrage. For instance, the appointment of alleged rapist Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. So they were examining what does outraged language look like and what really qualifies as an outraged post. Because we have to quantify these things. This is the work of operationalization, taking a general abstract idea of a variable and translating it into a specific quantifiable measure. Based on the language used in these posts, Brady et al. Arrived at this definition of moral outrage. So they assessed morally outraged posts and from the data arrived at this definition, as well as some theorization. Because science should always be both data and theory. A person can be viewed as expressing moral outrage if, 1, they have feelings in response to a perceived violation of their personal morals. 2, their feelings are composed of emotions such as anger, disgust, and contempt. And 3, the feelings are associated with specific reactions, including blaming people, events, or things, holding them responsible, or wanting to punish them. Posts that have elements of moral outrage tend to use words like disgrace, disgust, shame, and personal insults, refer to political opponents as subhuman, and treat unwanted events as unthinkable or outrageous, hence moral outrage. Here are some examples of both outraged and non-outraged Twitter posts from the original Brady 2021 study. So here is a post about Brett Kavanaugh that does exhibit outrage. At Senator Gillibrand, you are a disgrace. Shut your lying mouth. There is no evidence of assault. So this is someone outraged that Kavanaugh was accused of assault. A non-outraged post about that same topic is this one. At Jeff Flake, thank you for stepping up. Don't let them do a poor job in the investigation. So no sense of anger, blame, shame, unthinkableness, etc. there. Is there another? Oh, here's a Jesse Smollett post to go with another kind of United States-based example. This is an outraged post about Jesse Smollett. Hey, at Jesse Smollett, you are a worthless piece of shit, a greedy, corrupt liar. And for those who don't know, particularly non-U.S. Americans, the Jussie Smollett case was a case of an actor, a black actor who reported being a victim of a hate crime, and it later came to light that he appeared to have faked the hate crime, and this was a feeding frenzy for conservatives because it really fed into their narrative that racism isn't real and that people who complain about racism are opportunistic and are just doing it for their own personal benefit. So there was some outrage on the right about that, and on the moderate left too, I think. So they did a good cross section of different types of outrage from and topics where people could be outraged, kind of on either side, quote unquote, of the issue, to get a lot of different examples of morally outraged language. And this was the data that they kind of trained their digital outrage classifier on. In Brady's original work, human beings initially rated the moral outrage present in a post by specific aspects of the language used. Then a digital algorithm was trained on their feedback until it performed almost indistinguishably from real people. So initially, people were just given these posts and asked to look for signs of outrage based on this definition of outrage and based on certain example words. So if you were a rater, a research assistant for this study, you'd be shown a tweet and you'd be asked, does this post show feelings in response to a violation of morals? Are there words that signal feelings like anger, disgust, or contempt? And is there an element of blaming someone or wanting to hold someone responsible? And you would mark the extent to which each of those things was true. Then, after they had lots of data on these tweets that were scored by human beings, then an algorithm was trained to reproduce the work that human beings were doing until it would rank a tweet the exact same way that the human had ranked that tweet. In studies like these, it's actually quite straightforward to get a language analysis model to mimic a human being, because the human being research assistant is just being asked to look for specific words and turns of phrase and code whether those words or turns of phrase are present or not present. So it's pretty objective. You're looking at language, but it's with a very specific objective definition. Is a word like disgrace present? Is the emotion of disgust conveyed or not? Is there blame? And you can look linguistically at whether there's evidence that there is or not. And because it's that kind of straightforward, you can get an LLM or a AI model to do pretty similar work, actually. And this is something that a lot of researchers do today. And while this may seem like an overly simplistic and blunt way of making sense of the meaning and emotion contained within human writing, this is very much in line with what us social scientists have been doing for ages. So even if it makes you feel really uncomfortable to know that all of the data that I'm going to be talking about today did have an element of AI involved in assessing it, what the AI was doing was the exact same stuff that I, as a human rater, would have been asked to do when I was a research assistant working in labs in like 2008. I would have just been given writing like this and just been told, are there words that convey disgust or moral blame, and mark down yes or no with really specific definitions. And the definitions I'd be given are the same ones that the LLM would be given. And so the human way that this job has been done in social psychology up to this point is also very simplistic and blunt. And as I said, I became disillusioned with social scientific work for many reasons, and this is one of them. It is still limiting, right? Like, it is still having a very narrow definition of moral outrage. And what you think of as moral outrage might not be in line with this definition of moral outrage. It is operationalized. It's turned into a kind of straightforward recipe. And that means anytime you operationalize a variable, you're going to miss something. And you're going to miss a lot of the nuances because the map is not the territory. Gift Horse says this is exactly the kind of labor that makes sense to outsource to AI. I agree. And there is a use case for AI in scientific research, I believe. And especially if you have a separate AI model that is not ChatGPT. That's not what these researchers are using. They have to develop their own model that has their own limited training base, and it's only doing one specific rote job. It's not generating anything. It's just scoring things and scanning for things in an existing base of data. And I think it's efficient, and it's something that researchers do use and that they're going to use, and it's important, I think, for people to know, especially if you are someone who's heavily AI critical. That this is just a reality. Readers who are wary of any form of digitally assisted or AI-driven data analysis, take note. Algorithmic models very much play a key role in how science gets performed right now, even in many of those AI critical studies that you've probably heard about. This is a link to my previous piece. There is no evidence that AI causes brain damage, not yet anyway. And this is about a viral study that was getting misreported as showing that using ChatGPT causes you brain damage. One, that is not what this study found. It just found that people use different parts of their brain when working with ChatGPT to write versus when not using ChatGPT to write, which is true of any tool. If you use a tool, your brain activity looks differently than when you're not using the tool. And a funny irony about this study is that this study itself used AI to analyze its data. And so it's very, very fucking ironic to me that, and frustrating, that a lot of AI critics who are using this study to portray a very simplistic narrative of AI being damaging didn't realize they're using an AI analyzed study to make their point. There's nuances to this stuff. There's complexities to how it's used. And that's just how it is. I cannot tell you, the reader, what to make of this fact, but I want you to know that it is our present reality. any kind of large scientific study with a large data set that's being coded or analyzed, they're using AI pretty much to do it. So you can read more about that in that previous piece. So that was how they measured moral outrage in this base of over 1 million Twitter posts in this study. They're looking for those elements of language. Perceived violation of personal morals, anger, disgust, contempt, blame, and desire to hold someone accountable. That's what the model is looking for in the tweets. In addition to using Brady 2021's algorithmic measure of moral outrage, Leach and colleagues used a similar model to measure agency. It was called the Berta agent, and it analyzes how much agentic language was used in each post. So what is a high agency post? It is a post that is encouraging readers to think of themselves as having the ability to take action, to influence outcomes in the world. You have the power to make decisions and take action, basically. So this is another algorithmic model, another AI model analyzing the lexical content of a post or the semantic content of a post, looking at the words to see what they mean. Generally speaking, in a high agency post, a user writes about being motivated, capable, and taking some kind of self-driven action. The idea here is that by using language that frames the reader as empowered and capable, a poster might be able to drive more of the audience to share and sign a petition. So you can make a difference. You have the power to be heard. You can affect this issue. You know, your actions matter. Those would be examples of kind of high agency post language. And this, again, was analyzed using an algorithm. The next variable looked at was collective language or community-oriented language. Leach and his team looked at whether each post addressed its audience collectively, looking at things like, were plural pronouns like we and us used? Or is it saying we can make a difference? We must act to help this population. We need to come together to make our voice heard. Things like that. And whether the post addresses the reader using terms like friend, neighbor, comrade, in a familiar shared identity kind of language, which the researchers refer to as signals of group identification. So that was one of your additional variables, this group identification or kind of collective address piece. A post that is high in group identification uses some of that language. Instead of saying, you need to do this, or, oh my God, the house is on fire, someone needs to do something, it's saying, we're all coming together to do this thing today. That kind of language. Finally, they looked at whether the posts relied on pro-social language. So language that talks about a person's actions as being beneficial for society or the collective, or altruistic, being good for other people just for the sake of doing something that's right. Interestingly, that's kind of a different side to morality, right? There's an element of morality wrapped up in pro-social language, right? You're telling someone your actions are morally good. But that's very different from moral outrage, right? We have the moral outrage variable that's like, something horrible is happening. I'm disgusted. It feels horrible. Someone needs to be punished. And pro-social language is saying, you're doing something good. You're doing something beneficial. You're a good person. You didn't have to do this, but you chose to do it, and so on. For example, by framing signing the petition as an empathetic or selfless act. Here's a sample of some of the pro-social words that the study authors scanned for. Originally taken from a study by I'm sorry, Eastern Europeans. Let me see if I can get my way through this one. Petrakowitz and colleagues. Petrakowitz and colleagues. I'm going to simplify it there, even though there's a bunch of consonants happening and I might not have had that right. Maybe I can see how to pronounce it on a quick Google search. Well, let me copy just the name. I'm really doing like professor brain level technology skills here. A Polish name. Pia Atraskiewicz. Pia attracts that does not help a ton. Let's see. And if you're wondering how audiobooks get made, when I ran into a word in my own books that I didn't know how to pronounce, this is literally what we would do. My director would just Google how to pronounce something, or they would try to look up a video of that author to see if that author that I was citing had ever given a talk and said their own name. And this is literally how we figured it out in the audiobook recording room. So, fun fact.
Pietraszkiewicz.
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 Pietraszkiewicz. It's not really like a V sound.
Pietraszkiewicz.
Pietraszkiewicz. So, Pietraszkiewicz and colleagues in 2017. If a post used language like this, it was considered a post that used pro-social language. So words like cooperative, grassroots, healthful, mutuality, mutual, pro-social, non-for-profit, empathize, empower, civic, awareness, altruistic, responsible, selfless, social benefit, idealist, humanness, humanitarianism, equality, equal, cooperative, solidarity, social change, donator, egalitarian. Some of these words you might want to question, is this really evidence of pro-social language? Is just saying activism pro-social? Is that really pro-socially motivating? But I think in this case you can make that argument that if you're telling a reader clicking on this petition is an activist behavior, you're telling people that it means something, and that it's beneficial to a greater cause. And so I think you can make the argument that that is pro-social language. But there is also a little bit of an overlap with some of our other variables. Some of these terms certainly are similar to group identification. So, for example, telling people that they're, working cooperatively with other people, that's kind of also a community or group identification signal. And there's some terms here that I think a lot of us here in this space, being critical of nonprofits and institutions, we might kind of question whether using just the word nonprofit is a pro-social signal, because a lot of us would kind of question whether most nonprofits really are pro-social in any way. But regardless, these are some of the words that were examined in the study and used for the measure of pro-sociality. And I found all of this stuff by digging into the, not just reading the study, but looking into the full list of materials that the researchers posted along with the article, which is really great that has become a norm in social psychology now. Most people, if they publish a study, they're going to give you an appendix with all of their materials and all of their scoring methods. And that did not used to be the case. That was not the case when I was coming up, if you can believe it. A lot of science was kept very gate-kept and very hidden from the public eye. So even if you wanted to reproduce somebody else's results, you kind of couldn't do it because you didn't have that recipe book in front of you or the ingredients. Hello, Closet Demon. Meow. Meowdy. So altogether, we have 4 measured variables that were looked at in terms of content in a tweet that might predict a post's popularity or its political success. How much the post promotes a sense of moral outrage, how much agency it encourages in the reader, how much the post presents signing or sharing the petition as a collective effort or a group effort, and finally, how much the post treats signing and sharing the petition as a socially beneficial or pro-social act. So, if you really want to talk about research methodology, you have yourself here 4 measured IVs, 4 measured independent variables, predictor variables. Nothing was manipulated. This wasn't an experiment. We're just looking at and trying to capture real-world behavior alongside these variable dimensions. And the study's primary outcome variables were how many times each post was liked, how many times each post was shared, and how many signatures each petition received. So again, using your research methodology 101 type of language, there were 3 measured dependent variables or outcome variables. 2 have to do with virality, how much was the post shared and how much was the post liked. And the third has to do with, at least from the researcher's perspective, taking political action. Did the person actually click the link to the petition? So, and I know the title of the article kind of gives the major finding away. What did Leach and colleagues find? Here we have a graph from the original study. So it shows us it's as the outcome variable is kind of tracked along the x-axis or the bottom axis, and we have our 4 predictor variables: moral outrage, agency, group identity, and prosociality, marked as categories on the y-axis of the graph on the vertical axis. And you, so basically, just to orient yourself mathematically here, the farther to the right a score is, the higher it is, right? So if you're looking at likes and it's really far to the right, that means it got a lot of likes. There are error bars here, and then there's averages. So the little dots represent the average nature of the relationship, and the size of the bars represents how much error variance, just how much kind of general noise there is in the data. And so a wider bar means you should kind of be less certain that the dot really is exactly where it's been placed, because there's just a lot of variability and a lot of error variance in the data. And error variance does not mean a mistake. Error variance just means there's a lot of noise in the data, a lot of just varying scores that can't be accounted for using just this variable. So that's what we mean when we talk about errors in social science research. It doesn't mean you can't count on the results because there's a mistake. It just means there's a lot of noise in this data. There's clearly other variables at play, and there's just a lot of range in scores. So there might be outliers, for example, really extreme scores. And really extreme scores aren't a mistake on the researcher's part. It's just, the data is just kind of messy, and it just has some really extreme highs and extreme lows, and so we can't be as certain of our averages because there are these huge pulls on either end of the spectrum. And the colors here in the graph represent the 3 outcome variables. So this kind of blackish dark blue color represents the number of likes and the relationship between a variable and likes. The kind of pinkish color represents reposts or retweets. So those are your 2 social popularity measures. And then finally, the yellow mustardy color represents the relationship between the variable and signatures. Kate Schuer says, assuming these are standardized betas, this looks like a fairly large effect size to me, but also this is not my field. Do you have a sense of the effect size here? Yes, good eyeball. So, we want to look a little bit at the size of the error variances, but basically, first of all, yes, they are standardized statistical results. So everything here is kind of as comparable as it can be to other scores and results, and put within the terms of the actual test statistic, rather than being skewed by just different sources of variance in the data. For social science research, these are pretty good effect sizes. But also, you can see that with something like the signatures variable, there's a lot more error variance. These error bars are kind of huge. So there's some mess in here too. I don't know what field you're in, but here in social psychology, we typically have really small effect sizes. But so if you're looking at an effect size of a full point, that is usually a pretty masterful effect. That's bigger than we often see. So this stuff is significant. It seems to be real, and we are, bear in mind, looking at a really large sample size. So this is a study with a really high power score. And for those who don't know, power is basically your ability to detect an effect that's actually there. So this is a really heavily powered study. It's very unlikely to have something called a type 2 error or a false negative, meaning if there's an effect in this data, we're probably going to find it. with how large the sample size is. So yeah, it's a pretty big effect size, especially for social science. Male Valen says, I'm confused about the horizontal error bars. Don't we know whether a post was shared or not? We're like, where does this come from? Well, keep in mind, this is looking at the relationship between moral outrage and shares. So we're not looking here at this graph at something like the average number of shares. We're looking at the size of the relationship between moral outrage and shares, or agency and shares. And so this does not represent like what's along the x-axis here at the bottom of the graph. Those numbers don't represent anything like any kind of real tangible thing in terms of number of shares that is binary like that. It's looking at the statistical size of the relationship between moral outrage and shares, and whether it's a positive relationship. So we're getting a sense of the direction of the relationship. Are these things positively associated, and the size of the relationship, but we're not getting the actual like descriptive statistics or like output kind of results of like how many shares were there, how many reposts were there, or like even what the exact correlation, like correlational relationship on like a scatter plot would be. That's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is how much is group identity related to signatures. And for that, there is a lot of error variance because there are other variables predicting whether something gets signed or not. We're looking at basically how well does group identity, for example, explain the variance in signatures. And that is really just a statistical measure of the size of the statistical relationship. That's what we're looking at. The size and direction of the statistical relationship, not the actual numbers. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Effect sizes are certainly harder to explain than like something like, like a linear like correlation relationship, but that's kind of what's going on there. So I have it written down and I'll talk about it in writing, but first let's just kind of look at the graph. We can see here that morally outraged posts had a positive effect on likes and reposts, but a pretty non-significant effect on shares, the yellow bar. And basically your test of significance here is this dotted line at the 1.0 mark. So if a bar or a point is far away from that 1.0 mark, then it suggests that there is really a significant effect of the variable. So moral outrage has a significant positive effect on likes and reposts, but not on signatures. Agency here has a significant effect on signatures, a significant positive effect on signatures, but it has a null effect on likes. So there's no relationship between agency and likes, and we know that because the error bar overlaps with that that line of significance. And it has a negative effect on reposts, a small but significant effect on negative effect on reposts. And we can tell that because the error bar for reposts, which is in the pink, is not touching the kind of, let's just call it line of significance, and it's below it. So there's a significant but small and negative effect of agency on reposts. For group identity, again, we see a positive effect of group identity on signatures. It is significantly far away and to the right of the line here. There's a slight positive effect of group identity language on reposts, and then there's a null effect, no significant effect of group identity, of group identity on likes. I'm sorry, because that bar overlaps. And then finally, prosociality, we also see a really significant, this is actually appears to be the largest effect, though there is some major overlap between the error bars for signatures for our other two positive effects. But there's a pretty positive effect and significant effect of prosociality here, where it seems like using prosocial language in a post leads to more signatures or is associated with more signatures. And there's kind of no statistical relationship between the likes and reposts and prosociality. Hello, Grandcraft. Welcome. Male Valen says, yeah, I don't know enough statistics to know what beta is. Yes. So in this case, beta is a measure of effect size, which is usually this is something that used to not be super reported in a lot of social scientific research, or like people would always just look at, is it a significant effect? And now we look more at effect size because it tells us really the strength of the effect and gives us a better gauge of our confidence that the effect is really doing something meaningful, that like not only is it significant in this study, but it's really associated with a lot of movement in the data, where we can really say that like, okay, not only is smoking significantly correlated with cancer, but smoking really actually does have a pretty large effect, a meaningful effect on your cancer risk. Because something could have a pretty consistent, statistically significant effect, but it could be really small. Whereas effect size is really a measure of both significance and kind of the power of the effect. Um, Sebastian says, I'd say the error comes from the sample size. If we could theoretically produce an infinite sample, there would be no error bars. Yeah, that's true. If you use a statistical method like bootstrapping, where you take the existing data and reproduce the statistical results over and over again, and basically model the same study over and over again, that's sometimes done to kind of uh, mathematically kind of like jury rig your way into having that kind of effect. So yes, there is still an element of error in this sample. I mean, I would say sample size is a factor in your error variance, but also like it just comes from variance. If there is a ton of unexplained variability in your data, you're going to have more error bars as well. So whether a post gets signatures or not is something that varies a ton. If you really think about it, we're looking at 24,000 different change.org petitions. Some of those are really reasonable, politically motivating, interesting, relevant petitions where lots of people are clicking them. And some of those petitions are petitions that are just like some weird thing that some crank wrote. I have a change.org petition that I created about giving the Crafty Beaver logo a tail. Like, let me show you. So in Chicago, we have a hardware store called the Crafty Beaver, and he has this cute little mascot that's a little beaver in overalls, but he doesn't have a tail. The cutest feature and the most distinguishing feature of a beaver, and a part of his body he would definitely need if he's working on a household project. And he doesn't have a tail. So in like 2019 or something, or 2018, I made a change.org petition demanding that Crafty Beaver get a tail. So there's petition links like that on change.org. Some of these tweets that we're looking at are change.org petition links that are shit like give the Crafty Beaver a tail. And so, yeah, defuck, that's a gopher. Yeah. Sign my petition. I wonder if it's still on change.org. So people are going to click that petition link, even though I am completely morally righteous and correct. Thank you for demanding justice. You're welcome, Gift Horse. People are going to click that petition link less than a petition about something that matters. And so there is a source of variance that is not accounted for in this model, right? Some petition links are more likely to be clicked for a reason that is not accounted for by these four variables. And that is error variance. That is variability in the sample that is left unexplained by these variables. That does not mean that these variables don't have an effect. It just means if you're trying to predict whether a petition link gets signed, these are not the only things you can look at. This does not do all of the work of explaining the variance, the variability, the spread in whether a petition link gets clicked or not. There's other factors in there, including whether the petition link is silly nonsense, whether it's written well at all, whether it's relevant to a person's local area. Lots of variables that were not examined in this study. And so that all falls under the banner of error variance. But again, it's not a mistake. It just means that this study isn't capturing everything. Birdie Bit says, would you think of it as a feature of social science trying to make trends of individuals? Yes, it's a natural consequence of not measuring everything, is more what I would say. That like almost nothing can be perfectly statistically modeled. It's like chaos theory shit. Like there's just so much variability in human behavior that is left unexplained. Humans are so dynamic, they're so complicated, we are so influenced by so many different things that it is basically impossible to make a statistical model that can predict everything we're going to do. And even if we could build that kind of model, we human beings would not be able to understand it because it would have so many variables that we couldn't understand like the interactions between all of the variables. Um, the most that they've studied this, they've studied social scientists' own ability to interpret social science results, and what they found is that like at most we can understand an interaction between like 3 or 4 variables. Once you add more variables than that to a model, it's really hard for us to even explain what we're looking at, even if we're the people who studied it. So error variance is natural. It's not a problem. It's just a reality. I find it beautiful. I find it actually kind of almost inspiring of belief in like if you want to believe in human willpower or humans not just being themselves, algorithms or automatons, error variance gives us a sense of mystery and beauty and humility in understanding how humans behave. And error variance reminds us that we are not gods and we can't see and know everything. We really can only know the one little thing that we're looking at. And so I love small effect sizes. I love small effect sizes because it means humans are more complicated than any of the little dumb shit that we're measuring. Um, so you're always going to have error variance, unless you're measuring something that is completely like a physics problem where in a vacuum where this variable 100% affects this outcome. 100% of the time. Humans aren't like that. Um, Let me see if I can find my petition. Yes! Here's my petition. Give the crafty beaver a tail. This petition only had 15 supporters. Look, it's by me. Pre-transition. So, there's limits to how I started this petition 10 years ago in 2015 or 2016. I think 2016. Give the crafty beaver a tail. And I did tweet about it. So it would not have ended up in this study because it was 10 years ago. It was not in 2023. But if they looked back at 2016 Twitter posts, then my stupid petition would have been in, and the posts about it would have been in the analysis. Hello, Waluigi Bowser Jr. Welcome. So now that I've talked a ton about what the results look like in the graph, let me give you the simplified version. The findings. As the title of this research article suggests, posts that used morally outraged language were retweeted and liked more. Let's just look up at this first part of the graph. There is a significant relationship between likes and reposts and moral outrage. So if people were like, this is unthinkable, I am disgusted, blah, 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 those posts tended to be shared more and liked more. However, the petitions linked within those same morally outraged posts were not more likely to be signed. There was no relationship. Not a negative relationship, no relationship. Readers should note that morally outraged language did not harm a petitioner's signature rate in any way. It just failed to make any statistical difference whatsoever. So that's interesting. My gut feelings of not liking morally outraged posts and that kind of like manipulation, and me seeing the study title at first, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to give me a chance to be sanctimonious at the people who are sanctimonious online. And that's not quite the finding here. It's just that it helps move a post on the social media site, but it does not get a person to click a link and take an action off the site. The researchers refer to liking and sharing a post as immediate actions. They're very instantly gratifying and easy to do. We can also think of them as social or performative actions, since whether you share or like a post is more visible to your mutuals on Twitter than whether you go and sign the petition off the website. Most people that follow you are not going to look at whether you clicked the link. Leach and colleagues call signing a petition a more effortful action. And it is one with greater psychological barriers. It takes more time. You have to navigate to a different website. You have to read the whole petition or at least scroll past all of its language. You have to log into the change.org platform potentially. You have to fill out the signature form. You might have to put down some personal information, which might mean that you are personally exposed or revealed, or that you get more annoying emails. And each one of these things is going to lead to some fall off. A person might click the link but not get all the way through to signing the petition because of each of these barriers. This is a really important principle for driving any kind of change in action. The more difficult you make it, even if you think it's a small difficulty that no one should care about, the fewer people are going to do the thing. The more confusing it is, the more time it takes, the more of a hassle, the more of an annoyance, the more just difficult it is, the less motivated people are going to be to follow through. All of this demands more of a person with less of an immediate reward. Most social psychologists would predict that the more challenging, confusing, and time-consuming a behavior is, and the less benefit a person receives for engaging in that behavior, the less reason they have to follow through on the behavior. And it appears that the language of moral outrage is not giving people enough of a motivation to push past those barriers. There is a social psychological theory that talks about this stuff. It's called the theory of reasoned action. And the idea here is that a person's belief about a behavior and whether they think a behavior is good will affect their overall feeling about the behavior. The opinions of other people and how much they are motivated to comply with social norms will affect their sense of whether it is normative or socially expected to engage in the behavior. And those two things will combine to create a person's behavioral intention. So, do I feel like this intention is meaningful and good? Plus, do I care what other people think? And do I think other people want me to engage in this behavior? Those two things kind of go together and form your behavioral intention, and that will predict whether you engage in the behavior. But it's not going to carry you all the way there. So there's also things like the theory of planned behavior that looks more at some of the barriers to behavioral action. And the theory of planned behavior says that you have your attitudes towards the behavior, your feeling about, is this a good thing to do? Is this something I want to do? Your sense of whether it's normative. So, do other people want me to do this? Is it considered socially desirable for me to do this? And then you also have your sense of whether you have control over your actions. This goes back to what Cloud said at the top of the show about how you might get people to care about an issue using a social media post, but if a person feels like they can't do anything about the issue, it's not going to matter in terms of their behavior. So the theory of planned behavior says your feelings about the behavior, whether you think other people want you to engage in the behavior, those things matter. But what also matters is whether you think you have control over your own behavior, whether you have agency. If you think that you can do something and that it's going to matter, that will also influence your behavioral intention, and it will also directly influence whether you do the behavior. So if you think that you can't do something, you're generally not going to do it, right? So that's also an element in here. If you are overwhelmed by all of the information on the Give the Crafty Beaver a Tail website, and you think, oh, I can't read all this shit, then you're not going to follow through on signing the petition because you literally think you don't have control over the behavior. There's lessons to be learned here in this theory for executive functioning stuff. If you think that you're not able to do something because you're overwhelmed, or if you think something is just not a desirable behavior, you're not going to do it. So you might have one variable here pushing you to take action. For example, a subjective norm. Let's say that you think you should brush your teeth because other people tell you you should brush your teeth. That might be one push toward brushing your teeth, but at the same time, if you hate brushing your teeth, if it makes you really uncomfortable and you feel like you just can't do it, you're still not going to brush your teeth. So really, we usually need all three of these things to be in line, where you want to do the behavior, you know other people want you to do the behavior, and you think you have the ability to do the behavior, will make you more inclined to do the behavior. And there's other factors that figure in too, like how soon the behavior comes after the intention. Because if I want to learn how to drive by Christmas, Christmas is pretty far away, so I really might not get to it. Versus if I need to drop off a letter today, I might actually do it because it's that proximal in time. So, little info dump about some of the other stuff I studied back in the day. The researchers also found that using the language of agency, shared group identity, and pro-sociality within a post had essentially the opposite effect of moral outrage. Posts that used a lot of agency-based language, for example, ones that described a political movement as striving toward victory or able to win, were more likely to get petitions signed. And we see that here. Agency-based language was associated with a strong positive effect on signatures. However, agency-based language actually made posts less likely to be shared, which I think is really interesting. If you're telling people, we're going to win, you can do this, you can make a difference, we can strive together towards victory, for some reason that makes them take action, or it's associated with them taking action, but not with sharing a post. Fascinating. One interpretation of this is that when people are feeling genuinely motivated to act, they might not see making a post as all that important because they've already taken action that matters. And they might see kind of the performative social realm of posting as less important. That's my thought. But if you have other thoughts on why agency-based language makes somebody less likely to retweet, let me know because I'm curious. Similarly, posts that framed a political issue in terms of a shared group identity, using collective pronouns like we and us, addressing the audience as a buddy, a neighbor, or a comrade, also generated far more petition signatures. Group identity-based posts were also slightly more likely to be shared, though group-based language had no apparent effect, either positive or negative, on likes. And again, scrolling back up to the graph, we see that here. There is a significant effect of group identity language on signatures. People were more likely to sign a petition if it was presented as, we are doing this. They were also more likely to repost the petition, but they were not more likely to like the post. It seems that by encouraging their audience to think of themselves as members of a collective, online activists can convince them to take action and, to a lesser extent, to digitally engage. Finally, pro-social language encouraging the audience to behave selflessly or generously, also promoted petition signatures, and it had no observable effect on likes or shares. Again, one last time going back up to the graph, because I think for stats, it's always helpful to just hammer it home multiple times. Pro-sociality had perhaps the biggest effect of all variables, though the error bars here make that a little specious, but certainly a strong effect on signatures. Pro-social language predicted more signatures, and it did not predict more retweets or more likes. It appears that by framing the act of signing a petition as a kindness or a humanitarian act done to others or to benefit the world, an online activist can help give their audience a reason to push themselves over some of those troublesome barriers to action. You're not just doing this thing because you're upset. You're not just doing this thing because it's a horrible thing in the world that's happening. You're doing it because you are helping people, and it's worth that extra time filling out change.org's login info. And so, one of the important takeaways here is that perhaps if you cannot make a call to action easier to follow, if what you're demanding of your audience is troublesome or inconvenient, it may be beneficial to frame the issue in pro-social terms of you're helping others, you're doing something that matters, and so the difficulty is a feature and not necessarily a bug. This finding seems very compatible with previous research into the effects of something called eco-guilt. And eco-guilt is basically how much a person feels like they should be doing more to benefit the environment or feels guilty that they've done something to harm the environment. And some previous research on eco-guilt has found that when individuals feel badly about not doing enough for the environment, when they feel eco-guilty, they might tell the researcher that they intend to do more, that behavioral intention piece. But their behavioral intention does not actually translate into a change in behavior. So going back to that theory of planned behavior, which I should have kept open. People, when they feel eco-guilty, they have a intention of doing more. But they don't actually get past that intention into behavior and do more. Because there is a big gap between, oh, I should recycle more. That's one thing that they look at in a lot of those studies is recycling. Or, oh, I should walk more and use my car less or whatever. That's another target behavior. People say they want to do that more when they feel guilty, but they don't actually do it more. Conversely, when a person feels pride about some pro-ecological action that they have already taken in the past, they are more likely to actually take steps to help the environment in the future. So, let me open this image in a new tab so we can look at it better. If I feel like, oh, I should be doing more for the environment, that's kind of personal attitude and subjective norm. Oh, I should be doing this. That affects behavioral intention, but you might not necessarily have that behavioral control piece. I should recycle, but I don't know if I can. I don't know if I have the energy. I don't know where to do it. I haven't done it before, or I don't consistently do it, so maybe it's really hard for me. That means it's not necessarily predicting the behavior. You're kind of feeling guilty and feeling like you should make a change, but you're not making it. However, if you have recycled and you feel really good about recycling, you know you can do it. That perceived behavioral control piece is on lock. You know you can recycle because you've already done it. You know you can take the bus to work because you've already done it. And it felt great. You feel like you're a great person for doing it. You want to feel great about it again, and so you'll engage in the behavior again. And your perceived behavioral control is correct, right? If a person feels like they can do something because they've already done it, they are accurate, right? Whereas if it's a behavior that you've never done before, you might not know whether you're able to do it. So, so there is an element of just like reflecting reality here. As so much of my own writing emphasizes, the behaviors that we facilitate and encourage will continue, and shame does not work. This is a link to a study on eco-guilt that I wrote about in my book on learning shame. Experiences of pride, not guilt, predict pro-environmental behavior when pro-environmental descriptive norms are more positive. So if somebody thinks they should be doing pro-environmental things, again, that subjective norm piece, and they feel proud of themselves for having already done pro-environmental things, it tends to snowball in a positive direction towards them doing more pro-environmental things. Finally, the researchers looked at a potential two-stage relationship between morally outraged language, post retweets, and petition signatures. And what they found adds an interesting nuance to the paper. Though morally outraged language did not increase the odds of a petition getting signatures, it did lead to posts getting more shared and liked. And there was a significant statistical relationship between shares and petition signatures. Oh my God, you're talking about Marty Seligman, Birdie Bits. Ugh, ooh, yes, ooh, yes, yes. We're in the same family of researchers. We're in the same academic lineage. I'll get to your comment in a second. So we've already seen here that moral outrage predicts more likes and reposts. What we don't see at all on this graph is whether likes and reposts itself predicts more signatures. And in fact, that is what the researchers found. Here is a chart from Leach et al.'s paper showing that while agency, group identification, and pro-social language each have a direct positive effect on earning a petition more signatures, moral outrage indirectly increases the signature rate, because what moral outrage does do is increase the number of reposts, and that just gets the petition in front of more people. So eventually someone down the line is more likely to click on it and actually fill it out. So here is the statistical relationship. Here, the larger the number, the larger the effect size. And the more asterisks, the more significant it is. And if there's no asterisks, it is not a significant effect. Most of this is just rehashing what we already talked about. So agency directly predicts signatures. Group identity directly predicts signatures. Pro-social language directly predicts signatures. The moral outrage relationship here is actually not significant until you look at the what's called a mediating effect. So moral outrage, and that's why it's a dotted line, or an indirect effect. Moral outrage significantly predicts reposts, and reposts significantly predict signatures. And so down the line, if we look in the larger kind of funnel of causality and how all these variables kind of tip into each other, if you make a morally outraged post, at the end of the day, your petition is going to get more clicks. Maybe not because of your post, but because somebody else posts about it somewhere down the line. If you're not familiar with these kinds of statistical analyses being performed here, this pattern of results might not make sense. How can it be the case that moral outrage has no effect on signatures, but by increasing shares, it does increase signatures? We don't know the exact mechanism happening here, but I think it is something like a downstream effect. That, like, it's kind of over time, there's a positive effect of moral outrage on shares and shares on signatures. The people who read a morally outraged post and chose to share it are not, as a rule, the same people who are following through and signing the petition, right? I see a post using morally outraged language about some topic. I feel sick in my tummy. I repost the petition. I don't click the petition link, but I did repost it. Maybe one of my friends sees my repost of the petition that does not use morally outraged language, and they click on the petition. So, through this indirect chain, moral outrage affected me into reposting, and my repost affected someone else into clicking the petition. By sharing the petition more widely to their networks, those users are still increasing awareness of the petition, which in turn leads to more shares and perhaps some other posts being made about the petition. And some of those other people who see and post about the petition, they might use some of that nice, good, pro-social, agency promoting, group identified language that really helps get people to click a petition link. So this means, as much as someone like me hates a performative action on the internet, at the end of the day, if a performative action of sharing something or making a post gets a issue in front of more people's eyeballs, that is still going to translate eventually into more action. Even if it's not a direct effect, it is a stone dropped in a pond that has some ripples that are radiating out and that eventually lead to more action and more awareness and more talking about the thing. And so, regrettably, we have to give it to the people who make annoying posts on the internet, I think. I think that's part of the takeaway here, that it is beneficial to say this kind of stuff. Okay, let's there's some more messages in the chat I wanna look at. Closet Demon says brushing your teeth while showering is the best sensory cheat. However, getting yourself to shower. Talk about executive dysfunction. I love brushing my teeth while shitting or pissing. Like, I'm bored. I'm only going to be on the toilet for a limited amount of time. I want to move my hands. I'm brushing my teeth. That's my sensory cheat. Showering. I'm a big fan of space heaters. If you make the space more physically comfortable and there's less of a transition from clothes to naked to in the water to out of the water, dripping wet to towel and clothes again, that helps me. But I like showering and I like brushing my teeth, so I don't have the highest bar to clear there relative to other people. I come from a very dentally oriented family, as you can tell from my veneers. So and the whitening that I had done on me as a child. So you know, I'm not the best at telling people how to overcome that barrier. Wavelev says, this has taken me back to my psychology of environmental decisions class. Woo! How do people decide to use the hand air dryer to not pick up their dog's poop, etc.? Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research on that stuff. And it's sometimes they just ask and they do the shitty social science thing of just asking people about their intention. Like, now that you've gone through this laboratory study, do you want to recycle more? But sometimes they do actually look at, like, oh, we're going to watch the person in the bathroom and see if they wash their hands or use a hand air dryer or whatever. Some of the studies that a colleague of mine did was basically they paid the participants for doing the study, and then they also gave them a little envelope that they could put like a donation to an environmental cause in. So that was how they measured like pro-environmental action. However, a lot of these studies have been discredited in the replication crisis. So to go to the study that I just talked about, if you know the researcher is looking at you and is assessing whether or not you put $1 in the donation bucket, that's gonna and if that researcher has an expectation that you're going to donate based on what experimental condition you were in, that's gonna affect your behavior. So there's a lot of interesting research on environmental actions, and a lot of that research also just doesn't hold up. Waluigi and Bowser Jr. said, would all of this apply to mutual aid, supporting Palestinians, and calling your senators too? That's the big question. I think that's the big question. Clicking a petition link is one thing. So I will direct that back to y'all in the chat, and there's some of the writing here is going to get on this. Do you think these findings apply to mutual aid, supporting Palestinians, and calling senators? Does moral outrage help or hurt? Does pro-social language help or hurt? Are these general trends applicable to some of those actions? And we'll circle back and talk about it in a second. But I want to hear people's thoughts in the chat to that. Birdie Bits says, I think Marty Seligman wrote about it a few years ago. Dog shocking learned helplessness, positive psych guy. Saying helplessness is more the default while agency is learned. Yeah. And I say Marty Seligman because that's what my old PhD advisor was like, knew him, so it was like casual. Yeah. And some of the I think some of the learned helplessness studies also don't reproduce, but don't quote me on that. I would have to look that up, and I want to. Let's try it. Let's go to Google Scholar real quick and say replication learned helplessness Seligman. Here's some of the classics. God damn. Damn, these studies are old as fuck. I'm gonna click on since 2022. Online replication and validation. Let's see. Oop. Let's see here. While statistically significant differences were not observed between experimental groups, the results were mostly in the predicted direction. and influenced by the confounding variables. Pessimistic individuals, for the most part, were no more likely to be impaired by the effects of prior uncontrollability. Okay, so it seems like this is a really specific learned helplessness study. It sounds like there's some replication of some learned helplessness effects. Gift Horse says core family values, mouth bones. Very dentally oriented family. Very. My mom was a dental hygienist, and she did all my toothing for my tooth care for many years. So I associate tooth care with like maternal love, and so I'm pretty good on it. And like having good teeth with like being approved of by my mother. So I'm pretty on that shit. The subjective norm for me is very high, as is the perceived behavioral control, because I learned a lot about dental care, and my mom would talk to me about the science, which was really cool. So, what are the takeaways from this study? In this study, at least, it appears that any kind of rhetoric that boosts a political post's engagement is a net benefit to the movement. If you're getting people to share or like something, that's great. If you're getting people to actually click the petition, that's even better. But both are good. While the use of moral outrage in a post does not directly drive individuals to take positive, effortful action, such as clicking on a petition link, it does improve the overall performance of the petition via social and downstream effects. Furthermore, the study identified a number of specific choices that online activists can make if they want their audience to either perform a specific action or signal boost a call to action. So, what are the takeaways if we believe in this study? And I kind of generally do. I think it was pretty well done. 1. Encouraging your audience to see themselves as powerful, driven, and able to make a difference seems to make them more likely to take action. This is the agency piece. 2. Presenting a political issue as a collective problem with a shared solution and helping your audience to feel less alone seems to motivate both taking action and sharing information online. So talk in terms of the we. There's no disadvantage to this one. Talk about comrades, neighbors, we are doing this together, and talk about people being powerful and capable of making a change. Encouraging your audience to see a difficult or tedious action as an act of selflessness or a social responsibility that benefits other people can help get them over the hurdle of barriers to action. Finally, speaking moralistically about how disgusting, concerning, or frightening an issue is can get a lot of people to share posts about it, which can eventually lead to others making a more effective call to action. This goes back to what Birdie Bits said at the top of the stream. Sometimes you just want to set the agenda, get people talking about it, and then after that, you can motivate people to do something about it. Interestingly, agency and morality seem to have kind of opposing effects. Agency gets people to take action, but not to share posts. Moral outrage gets people to share posts, but not to take action. And so an effective campaign might include separate posts that contain elements of each of these things. But whatever you're doing persuasively, talk to your audience as if you and them are on the same team. And tell them that what they're doing is a positive thing for other people and the world and a thing they should feel good about. That, I think, is kind of the anatomy of an effective social media outreach, at least based on this study and some prior theorizing. This really seems to be an instance in which a rising tide of social media awareness truly lifts all boats. And as someone who frequently cautions against using heightened emotional language or shame-based messaging, I found this result surprising, and it caused me to check some of my own biases against this kind of messaging. And yet, as someone deeply familiar with the psychological research on attitude and behavior change, I can see the role that moral outrage might be able to play. According to the theory of planned behavior, a person has to possess both motivation and energy in order to complete a task. And it's hard to give your audience a big injection of both of these in a single social media post. It might be enough for one post or one dedicated social media campaign to get people caring and talking about a particular political issue for the first time. so that later, when another poster offers up a specific step that they can take to express that concern, they will be on board and ready for it. One of the major strengths of this particular study is that it observes thousands of real people's actual political behavior, whether they actually clicked the petition link, rather than asking them to role play in a laboratory or answer a hypothetical survey question about what they would do, a behavioral intention measure. But one of the primary limitations here is also the study's measure of political action. Signing a petition might require real energy and time, sure, but it is a far smaller call to action than getting masses of protesters out in the street in negative 5-degree weather at, let's say, Broadview Ice Facility, as happened here in Chicago, or even something like convincing people to slash an ICE agent's tires. Would Leach and Co.'s findings also apply to getting people to take more radical or physically demanding action? I don't know. As always, I am frustrated by social psychology's reliance upon a liberal democratic frame, in which the only means of making a political difference is by contributing to the mainstream discourse on the topic and participating in a political process as it is defined by the state. I would love to see data that examined the best ways to form a new mutual aid group or keep people routinely providing jail support. But anything outside of a symbolic, declarative political action is so far out of most social scientists' radars as to not be spoken of. The people who do this kind of research are typically people who believe in petitions and calling senators, in short, and might not even think about something like smashing windows or destroying other forms of property or starting a mutual aid group. And as the next study that I talk about will explore, these researchers equate charity and mutual aid as if they're the same thing. A lot of these types of researchers. But that'll be next week's article. However, in political science, we talk about boosting political engagement as a process of slowly moving individuals down a funnel. This is called the funnel of causality. So we see people as at first at the top of this giant funnel, where they're not maybe doing anything. And anything that nudges them further down that funnel of causality is kind of a win. We're pushing them slowly toward the behaviors that we might like them to take. Generally speaking, a person who has never participated in any political action of any kind is not going to come out guns blazing, ready to defend their block from fascist stormtroopers. Sometimes making a difference might genuinely start with sharing a post. It just cannot be allowed to end there. Up next in my Research Roundup series, this is an article that's going to go live on the 15th, so on Monday, how faith in the state can either help or hinder political engagement and volunteering. Really interesting study that we're going to talk about next week. If you like this piece, I have some similar writing, one on research into political polarization that argues that polarization, though it's a subject of many social scientists' study, it's a misplaced focus because getting people to reach across the aisle isn't helpful if it means listening to a transphobe or a fascist. I have an article on why shame does not work at motivating behavior. I also have a whole book on that called Unlearning Shame. And then here's another social scientific study that I was really happy to bring to a wider audience. A massive study of 16,000 participants in 23 countries finds people are more prejudiced against trans women than trans men. Trans misogyny real, even though the researcher had never heard of trans misogyny, apparently, which is crazy. So check out those studies if you're interested in that. I wanted to share one comment left on the post by Gabriella De Golia. They say, "Thank you for this great informative post. From an on-the-ground perspective during my work as a community organizer and campaign staffer in various places, this has all proven true in my experience. For example, if you're trying to get people to vote or join in a phone banking event or come to a rally, your turnout rate is much better when you use language like, 'Lots of us are coming together next week to do XYZ. We'd love to see you there with us.' As opposed to, 'Oh my God, everything's on fire and our success depends on you. You have to join us next week to do XYZ if we're gonna win this thing.' Pressure, guilt, fear, the pathological demand avoidance of it all. Not a good recipe. The first approach signals community, existing and future success, and a collective dispersion of labor. The former is anxiety provoking, unfairly burdening of individuals, a PDA trigger for some, and a shame induction for others. Speaking my language, Gabriella, oh my god. Obviously, the first approach leads to more participation. Grateful for research that helps explain that phenomenon. In the chat, Wave Left says, moral outrage can feel dysregulating when I'm already amped and anxious. I am less likely to engage because it makes my nervous system more taxed and thus harder to do everything. Birdie Bits says, damn, not to sum it up, but one thing I'm taking away is to think less about myself, because my actions are part of a big system of actors, and I probably can't really comprehend the whole thing myself. Yo, yes. Yes. That's the takeaway for both the messaging and thinking about the impact of our individual messaging, which is really cool. Like, if you want people to take an action and care about an issue, it seems to be helpful to say, hey, we're all in this together. What you do matters, and you can do something. It's not all on you, but here's one small thing you can do, right? Click this petition link, reshare this thing. Instead of, oh my God, the world's on fire, you need to save the day. We're all doing this thing. Here's one thing you can do, one way you can be part of it, and we're going to win. It's also true of posts, right? Your post is going to get the topic or the action in front of more eyeballs. You might not ever see whether you've changed someone's mind or you've moved someone to take action, but you might have through this really long-term downstream effect. And that also tracks with a lot of the research into persuasion, which finds that changing someone's mind takes a lot of time. It takes multiple attempts. They have to be open to it. And most of the time, you're not going to get to see the fruits of your labor. That doesn't mean that the conversations you have, the information you share, the listening that you do doesn't matter. It does matter. It just means you are just one variable, one factor in this huge funnel of causality. You are a little bit of a nudge further down the funnel, but you're not going to get to see all the effects. You're not omnipotent. You're not God. You're not that important. And yet you are part of something that matters. And that's like the messaging both that our posts kind of should have, and that's also something that we can keep in mind when we're making our posts or making our like political messages. That like, hey, it's not all on you. Just do what you can and remember that you are part of a larger thing, and help remind others that they too are part of a larger thing, which is really cool. So it's a little bit meta, and it's dope. I'm so happy that there are like other like scientists and social science people in the chat here. This is so fun. Grandcraft says, "Hey Devin, have you thought about doing these talks in person? If they would have me, you know, I love doing this kind of stuff, and this is something that I want to lean into doing more in the next couple of months. Is a lot more writing about research and talking about it, and moving a little bit away from personal stuff. Though I might have a post about that coming up soon too. And I'm really getting into doing more talks and engagements. It's just fun. So if you have, I don't know, a library, a anarchist book club, a conference, a class where you want to have me walk people through reading and interpreting research, I would love to do that. I like doing it. It's one of the uses of my skills as a social psychologist that doesn't feel ooky, and it's something that I do feel passionately about. So, yeah, any way where I can plug in some of these skills and thoughts in my analysis into making research more accessible to people, I would love to do. So, you know, I just need a place and an impetus to do it, because I think there could be a larger audience for this stuff, or it's just fun and fulfilling. Yeah, the furry portrait is still in the background. We are unbowed by YouTube censorship. All right, that is it for tonight, everybody. Will you record video or voice versions of past essays at some point? The Substack reader voice is meh. Yeah, you know, tell me which ones you want. Obviously these things, it ends up taking like 3 to 4 hours to do most of these. So, this was a short one at 2 hours and 15 minutes. I'd like to do more of them. I'd like to do more of my like classic hits, like the burnout piece and stuff like that. But send me an ask on Tumblr or leave a comment on a post saying like, hey, would you do a video of this one? And if I know there's a lot of demand for a particular one, or it seems timely to like discuss, I would like to revisit. I'm trying to juice my writing more often. I used to just be like a Gatling gun of posts, and that meant there was never enough time for people to read them, all of them. And now I want to like repost things as they become relevant again, really massage the meat, get all the juices out of it, and talk about it with people more because I think that's a better use of my energy and less wasted time and energy. So thank you everybody for watching the juice. I gotta get going, but this was really fun. This will be on my YouTube, and I'll post it on Substack as well. If you're liking these discussions, join the Discord. Follow me on YouTube. You can get my writing on Substack at drdevinprice.substack.com. And next week on Monday, we're going to have a post about faith in the state and how that affects political engagement, mutual aid donations, volunteering, charity, etc. So interesting stuff, I think. All right, and then I'll stream that one relatively soon too. All right, thanks for being here, everyone. And I'll see you on here again some other time soon.